Sustainability can mean everything and nothing, depending on who you ask and where they live.
Has anyone actually shifted the needle because smart people got into a room and, like made tough choices, and then all of a sudden things are getting better?
Skepticism is warranted. We are not going to have zero hydrocarbons by 2030 or 2040. The state of Qatar, it's developed 4 pillars: increasing production domestically, diversifying food trade, improving efficiency domestically, establishing an emergency food reserve system. We face a number of challenges: sea level rise, increasing temperatures, extreme weather events, which include heat waves, dust storms and sandstorms, extreme rainfall and flooding, biodiversity loss. A desert might not appear to be full of life, but it is full of life. Some of these risks are outside of our control.
Can I ask a question about EVs? Is this a net positive for the environment?
EVs require lithium. You need cobalt, you need graphite, you need a whole lot more copper. And where do you get all these materials is through mining. And mining is not particularly positive for the environment. Most of the cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are serious and well-documented concerns about human rights abuse and child labor. The production of electric vehicle produces a lot more carbon emissions than a traditional gasoline-powered vehicle in its manufacturing process. When we plug our electric vehicle in, where's that energy coming from? Yeah. If I take a different perspective, if you see pictures of some of the major Chinese cities 20 years ago and today, it's an unbelievable transformation. And one of the main drivers of that has been transitioning its transportation sector from gasoline-powered to electrifying it.
Hey, welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on this series, I'm joined by Logan Cochrane, who is a professor of public policy at HBKU in Qatar and is the author of a book called Sustainable Qatar. Logan, welcome to the series.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So I want to talk about sustainability. That's kind of the whole subject of the reason why I brought you on. It's one of those words that gets thrown around a lot by people like me who don't really know what it means in the context of sort of policy and scientific conversation. So let's just start really with a basic thing, which is a lot of people will say, they might see a book called Sustainable Qatar and they'll be like, walk me through what sustainability means in the GCC and the Arabian Peninsula and Qatar specifically, and what sort of are the challenges and opportunities from a sustainability perspective that policymakers and scholars like you are thinking about?
Right. It's a great question because sustainability can mean everything and nothing. And it also means different things depending on who you ask and where they live. The natural endowments and challenges of each country differs. Even within countries can differ. So what sustainability means, and particularly the priorities of moving towards a more sustainable future, is going to vary if you're speaking to someone in Bangladesh or in Norway or here in Qatar. So what it means for us is looking at the risks that we face. And here I'm thinking about sustainability from a more environmental and climate change perspective. But we can also think about sustainability from an economic perspective. We can think about it from broadening our diversification of our economy from a hydrocarbon one to other sectors, non-hydrocarbon related sectors. So that's financial sustainability. So how we define these terms does really matter. But let me start with the environmental and climate change related sustainability components. So for us in the near to long term, in the state of Qatar and also in the broader GCC region, we face a number of similar challenges. These include sea level rise. We have a lot of our population living in coastal areas, and sea level rise, particularly in the longer term, will start to impact our coastal infrastructure, many of which is of high value for our economies and where our people live. We will face increasing temperatures slowly over the duration, but in tandem with that, we'll face extreme weather events, which include heat waves. And both of those can impact human health. It can also impact sectors in the economy. Like if we don't prepare our healthcare industry appropriately, it can overheat. And we've seen countries experience some of this.
Healthcare specifically?
You can imagine any type of electrical systems, computer systems. where if you don't have heating and cooling appropriately managed and those are overwhelmed, then you can have these systems become non-functional due to these extended heat waves. So we have other forms of extreme weather events that we expect, like dust storms and sandstorms, and maybe surprising for some of our audience not familiar with the region, but extreme weather events in the form of extreme rainfall and flooding. Yes, we live primarily in a desert where we don't have any lakes and rivers, but we do anticipate towards the end of the century increased rainfall in short periods of time. We've seen examples of this in the UAE recently. Qatar's experienced this, where we need to think about infrastructure to manage flooding. We will and are, as a region, experiencing biodiversity loss. In the news, we tend to hear about coral reefs and seagrasses and marine life, but this also applies to terrestrial biodiversity. A desert might not appear to be full of life, but it is full of life. And these are also impacted not just by climate change, meaning heat stress and increasing heat temperatures, but also human activities, human development, and so forth.
Yeah. Logan, can I stop you for a second? I'm curious, what sort of time scale are you talking about? Because like right off the jump, you said sea levels are rising. The first question is that a controversial statement within the sort of scientific and policy community? That's the first question. And the second question is, what is the time sort of scale that you're talking about in your book and in your research when you think about that type of issue and whether it is sustainable as an economy, as a society, in these places?
It's a great question. When we did the Sustainable Qatar book, myself and Reem Al-Hababi, who's a graduate of our program, now doing a PhD, we edited this book, so we didn't write all of the chapters, and we brought all together experts from different sectors, and we tried to make their research accessible to decision makers and the broader public. We presented this book with the state of Qatar at COP27 in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, and afterwards, one of the questions from the ministry, and the then minister wrote a foreword to the book, and the questions with the ministry was, okay, great, you've got all these issues in this book, but where do we start? Because every country, regardless of whether it being high GDP or low GDP, has limitations of time, resources, and capacity. And that also applies to the state of Qatar and the region. So then you get to your question about prioritization. Are these near-term risks? And how severe are these risks? How high should we prioritize them? So following those questions from the ministry, Reem and I did a second project, which was around risk prioritization. And the interesting challenge for academics is that academics tend to work on a bit of a slower time frame. We apply for a research grant. 6 months later, it might get funded. 6 months later, we might get some findings or an IRB approval to collect data. And then 18 months later, the paper gets published. Governments don't work on that kind of time frame. Governments need to make decisions quickly. So we need to find a methodology that gave quick answers to your question.
It depends on the government.
Sure. Ideally, governments need to make informed decisions that respond to challenges quickly. So we put together a risk categorization. And this gets to your question because 3 of our metrics that we analyzed, one of them was timescale. How is this a near term, like today problem? Is this a 20, 50, 70, 100-year problem? Because that relates to resource allocation. Do we need to build seawalls today, or do we need to build them in 30 or 40 years? And all the other examples that I gave. The 2 other domains we looked at were severity and degree of control. Severity meaning how big of a risk is this for the country? And the severity does vary on the impact that these climate change and environmental challenges will have, both on human health and the economy and biodiversity and so forth. And the last part, degree of control, is fascinating because some of these risks, the root causes of them, are outside of our control. So we need to think about domains of control or spheres of control in our decision making to be able to react to some of these. Can we prevent the root cause of this, or are we adapting to the risks we face?
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about water and food specifically. Obviously, in the Arabian Peninsula, a lot of it is desert. food has always been a challenge. When you don't have a ton of land that is suitable for agriculture, these are issues. And obviously, water is a challenge as well. How is that actually changing? Is it getting easier? Is it getting better or worse in surprising ways?
The region faced wake-up calls in there being net food importing as a region and as countries, the global financial crisis, then the global pandemic, and for the state of Qatar, when it had its political issues with its neighbors between 2017 and 2021, where global supply chains or access to global markets were completely disrupted. If you're reliant on importing food to meet your food security needs as a nation, this wake-up call makes you rethink how resilient is our food system to be able to meet the needs of our people. And this has, across the region, across the GCC in particular, has put a lot of emphasis on how do we have a more sustainable food system. If I give an example from the state of Qatar, it's developed 4 pillars. One of these pillars is to improve production domestically of crops that can grow here well. And there are some crops that can grow here really well, particularly during the non-summer months. So like, let's say 9 months of the year, you can grow tomatoes, cucumbers, lots of leafy greens, and so forth. The environment is well suited to produce those in open areas or using greenhouses. The second pillar they developed was trade diversification. So what we learned from these shocks that I mentioned earlier was that if you rely on one trade partner for, let's say, all of your source of chicken or all of your source of
Cows.
bananas, yeah, and that source gets disrupted, and that could be for a number of reasons. We've seen in recent conflicts that some countries have stopped or been forced to stop their trade with other neighbors. We've seen some countries when they experience climate change events and there's a drought in their country and production is lower, that they reduce exports. And so in the last 15 years, we've experienced all sorts of reasons why trade diversification is really important to enhance resilience. So that's the second thing we've been working on.
So just to be clear, Logan, you're talking about resilience in terms of supply chain disruption, not macro resilience in terms of the earth is falling apart and what do we do? You're talking about okay, when there are issues and sort of disruptions in the broader economic system, geopolitical and geoeconomic system that affect food availability, how can we actually make ourselves a little more durable to withstand those shocks?
Yes, and I would say not only withstand them, but become stronger because of them. Build our capacities to become much more resilient, if you like, as a result of experiencing those shocks. So, sometimes when you talk about the adaptation literature, you have a steady state, you experience a shock, and then you recover from the shock. We do want to recover, but actually we want to move beyond recovery and move towards enhanced resilience.
Okay, continue with the pillars. Let's keep going.
Okay, so we had increasing production domestically, diversifying food trade, meaning that we import to reduce the risks of having one supplier. The next pillar was improving efficiency domestically. So this means reducing food loss, reducing food waste, having farm to market opportunities where you're not losing due to lack of refrigeration or logistics and so forth. And the fourth pillar was establishing an emergency food reserve system. And this is if you experience a shock and you don't have access to global markets, how will you have a buffer to be able to overcome that shock? So now we have, in the state of Qatar and some of our neighbors as well, we have an emergency food reserve. And this does a couple of things. If we experience a shock, we've got food on supply and it could be provided to the market. It also helps stabilize prices. A lot of products are seasonally grown. And if we have a steady supply that's filtered through this food reserve system, that it can help stabilize prices and make more food affordable for everyone.
Can I ask a question about this?
Definitely.
Do you have precise examples of what this looks like? Are there really good dairy companies that have emerged that are perfect example?
So in the state of Qatar, during the political issues we face with our neighbors, previous to that, all of our dairy products were imported through or from Saudi Arabia. And when that air, land, and sea option was closed, the country had to respond to that shock and developed its own dairy industry. And in very short order, has developed primarily through Beledna, but other companies as well have emerged in the dairy industry to provide self-sufficiency in milk products and yogurt products and other sorts of dairy commodities. So that's an example of domestic production. From the food reserve side, an example here would be, we tend to think about commodities that we all need that are perishable. So we might have refrigerated stores of things that we don't produce domestically, but we import so that if there was a shock, we can provide it to the market and meet everyone's needs. In the design of the food reserve here in Qatar, it's actually three parts. There is the perishable food goods, the non-perishable food goods, which have different rotation cycles. And then you also have a third layer, which involves the private sector. And the private sector has increased stocking, meaning they just hold more food. So the entire food system becomes more robust to be able to overcome shocks. The food reserve is a widely used tool. The ASEAN countries in Asia use this. They have a rice mechanism. Saudi Arabia, India, the US, China, a lot of countries use food reserves in this similar way. And it's a risk mitigation tool.
Okay, cool. Okay, so that's food. Let's talk about water. Did I get through
So
all the pillars or no? Are there some pillars left?
those are the four pillars. There's an invisible fifth pillar, which I think is fascinating, and maybe because I sit at a university, but the invisible fifth pillar, and this is a really great lesson for other countries, is research on food security. Very few research papers were available. The ministry then co-funded a research call with the National Research Funder to help spur new research in this topic. And this invisible fifth pillar has been fantastic. We went from like 10 papers about food security to over 100 in very short order. So the evidence base to help decision making as a result of the ministry partnering with the national research donor or research funder has created this invisible fifth pillar that has been fantastic enabler of evidence.
Cool. Let's talk about water. First of all, before you talk about how things have become more resilient, lay the sort of the groundwork on where do people get drinking water today and where did they get drinking water, for example, 30 years ago?
Great. So for the GCC, this varies significantly. The situation in Oman, the situation in Saudi Arabia, the situation in Qatar does differ. So I just put that out there. Maybe I'll focus on Qatar to keep the story simpler. We have no lakes, no rivers. Our freshwater access historically was, through wells and the groundwater. There is groundwater, and that presents a limitation for us. How do we overcome that limitation? Is that we use desalination to provide all of our drinking water, all the water that we use. And the groundwater is used in very limited way, primarily with the agricultural sector. And there are a lot of efforts to reduce the extraction of groundwater because the groundwater levels are depleting. They're not being replenished at the same rate that they're being extracted. And then the third kind of source of water is that when we all use our water every day, it just goes down the tap, that we can recycle, treat that water, reuse that water. Currently in the state of Qatar, a lot of that water is used for outdoors, like watering trees, watering the various landscaping and so forth. Bits and pieces in the agricultural sector currently doesn't filter back into your tap. But some countries in the region are doing that, full water recycling systems. And that's sort of the source of our water. It presents limitation for the food production that we currently mentioned. There is land in the region, and one of the limitations is not only access to water, but the cost of producing that water through energy-intensive desalination processes.
We're focusing on Qatar today for sure, because that's where you live and this is sort of what you study. But if you look around the Arabian Peninsula, I'm curious how this sort of looks in different places. Like, for example, I was in Kuwait recently. They're like dealing with like rolling blackouts. They have like a lot of very big issues related to heat, environmentalism, and sort of the environment in general. Um, do you expect those challenges to sort of like ripple through the region? Um, and it's just a matter of time if we don't sort of prepare ourselves?
It is a possibility. It is a pathway that things become increasingly difficult. And you've probably seen some headlines, even some academic articles in Nature saying that the region could be inhospitable by 2060, 2080, 2100. Usually these are about temperature rise and wet bulb temperatures and so forth. I think that's a pathway we need to be considered. We need to adapt ourselves to that. At the same time, there are lots of places around the world where the environment presents a lot of challenges. For example, I'm from Canada. Before I moved to Qatar, I was teaching at Carleton University, the capital of Ottawa, capital of Canada, Ottawa. And in the winter, we have minus 35, minus 40 for extended periods of time. And that is not very hospitable for human habitation. But we find
Sounds like a
ways
lot
to
of the AC in most of the GCC.
Well, it's kind of the opposite, right? Like
Yeah, it's the opposite.
we in Ottawa, the heating system is critical for human health, well-being, economic functioning, and the continuation of economic activity. And similarly here, it's the opposite. It's cooling. We have particularly hot months in the summer where the cooling systems become particularly important, in addition to other policies like regulating working hours during the hottest summer months, which we have in place. So there's these sorts of things where we can put in place responses adapting to these changing environmental conditions to have a different pathway, not the inhospitable pathway, but potentially another pathway which is demonstrating for the world how a sustainable future is in arid environments. How do we live in arid environments? And there are many across the Sahel, for example, across the Arab region and beyond, that will face and are facing these challenges. We do have the advantage of resources. We have the advantage of human talent and capacity. And I think we have the advantage of a lot of good strategy and foresight into the future with our research and development and leadership to be able to potentially become a leader in a future arid living.
There's a lot of conversation about energy transitions. We had an episode published a few months ago on this subject, and sort of the energy transition to hydrocarbon. I don't know the right way of asking this question, but as somebody like me, viewing this from afar, part of me just like is skeptical. Like, we're never going to do this. This is never going to happen. Am I right to be skeptical?
I think if the message that you're hearing is zero hydrocarbons by 2030, 2040, which, some of the headlines might misrepresent some of what governments have committed themselves to, then skepticism is warranted. We are not going to have zero hydrocarbons by 2030 or 2040, 2050. All of the projections show continued use of multiple forms of hydrocarbons, including coal. The transition fuel of natural gas shows continued or even expanded use through 2060. So I think the realistic view is that there is a transition towards a sustainable future that diversifies the energy mix to increase renewable usage while reducing reliance on hydrocarbons with time. And I think that's a more realistic view. Most of the future scenarios point us towards that direction. And as we mentioned earlier, every country has different resource endowments to take advantage of in that transition.
I can already hear the types of comments, the YouTube comments or Instagram comments on this type of conversation, and hear people listening to you and saying, "All right, but a lot of these efforts, this is all greenwashing. This is not an uncynical thing, right?" So I'm going to try to put you in a position to address those concerns and address those criticisms. But before you get to address them, I want you to try to define that term greenwashing, and we'll try to like have this conversation together, because I think there's a validity around having these conversations. But I want to actually talk to you about it because you would know more than I would.
So I think for your first question, what is greenwashing?
Yeah, like what do the smartest people in the room who are legitimately concerned, what are they talking about? Forget the sort of the trolls, but let's start with the best version of that type of criticism.
If you are causing a lot of environmental damage and use um, inappropriate metrics or incorrect metrics, incorrect reporting, and try to showcase yourself as being something you're not, we could call this, a form of greenwashing or false representation, that you're claiming something that's not. You've probably seen this in the ESG as it emerged, through the various corporate sector when people needed to report on environmental factors. And some of the countries that did extremely well were countries like companies that were like tobacco companies. So is that a particularly positive social good company? I personally don't think so. Did it perform particularly well on the ESG indicators? It did. So part of the answer to your question is we need to think really critically about the measures and metrics and indices that people are developing and sharing. And so if we're thinking about greenwashing, if someone says we're doing X, then we should ask critically, are you doing X? How are you measuring X? How can you prove that you're doing X in whatever it may be? Could be the energy transition, could be improving our efficiency of our building infrastructure and so forth. So I think for the skeptics who are wondering, is this real? Is this a greenwashing story? Or is there a transition happening towards a sustainable future in the GCC? I would say the GCC is in a transition like everyone else. Every country is grappling with various sustainability challenges, and so are we. No one is saying that we've made it and the transition is done and we've now landed at a sustainable future. There's lots of progress to be made. Our economies still rely heavily on our hydrocarbon resources, and there's lots of work to do in diversifying that. Our energy systems still rely heavily on hydrocarbon resources, and there's lots of work to do in moving towards adding more renewable mix and moving towards a sustainable future. At some point, these finite resources will run out. It's a question for us to answer: how are we going to overcome that challenge to become more sustainable in these various domains?
Yeah. Where are those criticisms coming from? Like you used to teach in Canada, you go to international conferences. What sort of sectors or corners are those criticisms coming from?
Well, if we think about a few examples, a recent major climate change conference was held in the region, and there was some criticism about, one, that choice of having a hydrocarbon producing and exporting country host one of these events, and the role of some corporations at that event. And so the critics would raise questions. And I think in the public policy space, when we think about how change happens, we need many voices in the room. Some of those voices are going to be working with oil and gas companies to help them reduce methane emissions, to help them reduce their carbon emissions, to help them invest in carbon capture and storage systems so that the contribution to climate change they're making is reduced. We need that dialogue. We also need the dialogue of the outsider, the activists, the NGOs who are pushing the envelope from the other side of the conversation. So I don't think it's a question of either or. I think it's a question of both. We need these voices. We need the critical conversation for the outsiders and the activists. And we need the insiders who are working with government and are working with corporations. And maybe the criticism is sometimes a misunderstanding of each other, that if you work with a government, that somehow you become co-opted and you can no longer be critical. And sometimes the criticism of the activists is that the message they're sending is not based in evidence or might be utilizing very extreme scenarios to base their concerns. So sometimes there could be just improved dialogue between the two. But I mean, my sort of takeaway, and as I work with students, depending on their career interests and their track, is that both of these are important.
Okay, amazing. I have a question for you. When you do your work every single day, do you find yourself optimistic or pessimistic?
I am a glass half full type person, and I think you have to be. From if we throw our hands up in the air and give up and think that this is an existential crisis and there's nothing we can do, it's all gonna end in fire and we're all doomed, that you don't wake up with the passion in the morning to work really hard and make positive change. So I am optimistic because that fuels my motivation to keep doing this work, to keep working, and that doesn't mean that we're not critical. It doesn't mean that we don't challenge. That's a part of being glass half full. In order to have the greatest impact, we need to know where the greatest challenges are. So a part of having that positive impact on society means you need to be critical.
When we think about sustainability, this is largely in some ways, it's like a scorekeeping exercise, right? When you think about it on a global basis, like who is most sustainable, right? Whose water bottle caps are no longer associated? How many light bulbs are we changing? How many tote bags are people carrying? Like there's all this like scorekeeping. Who is creating the scoring table? Who has sort of set the rules that we are measuring each other against?
This is great. Different people have set the rules may be the wrong word, but have set the measures that we report on and we track on. So if we think about the emission of greenhouse gases or the emission of carbon, there's a bunch of indices and organizations that track this. And what's interesting is how we report on this. So, for example, our region is most of the countries in our region produce oil and gas and export it to other countries around the world. So, for example, the state of Qatar, we produce a lot of liquefied natural gas as a part of our exports. And most of that goes to Asia, Japan, South Korea, China, India, etc. When we do the reporting, the extraction, production, exporting of the liquefied natural gas products to those countries results in the exporting nation having a relatively high emissions footprint. But the importing nations have a relatively low because they're getting a clean product in the end that doesn't involve the extraction
walk
and
me
production.
through who those nations are. Like give me some examples. Like
That's just like we export Japan, South Korea, India, China are the main buyers of Qatar's liquefied natural gas, and they are getting this liquefied natural gas product. One perspective, and this might anger some of the critics, is that in buying liquefied natural gas, they're able to transition to a cleaner fuel in comparison to burning coal. And countries like China and India do burn a lot of coal, which in the emission of carbon, burning coal is a lot worse than using liquefied natural gas. So they're moving to cleaner fuels, still hydrocarbon fuels. When we do the reporting side, or if we report emissions based on the source of where those emissions take place, then the countries that have to extract, produce, and export those resources are naturally having high levels of emissions. So, for example, methane. There's a lot of methane that goes through, that's emitted from the GCC region, and countries that buy the liquefied natural gas or the oil products in Asia are not seen as emitting those methane emissions, but they're buying it, and it's part of that supply chain process. You know, those emissions, we're essentially, if you think about it from more of a supply chain perspective, we should all be concerned about emissions beyond the source specifically. So if you're a buyer of coal, like there are a lot of countries export a lot of coal, a lot of countries are buying a lot of coal, and it's a product that we should probably be concerned about. You know, Australia exports a lot of coal. So countries should be particularly concerned about, not just the source, but also the buyers and the emissions throughout the whole supply chain. This applies not only to carbon emission reporting, but it applies to water. You've probably seen the water footprint reporting. Some countries include certain sectors in their water reporting, others don't. For example, some countries include their agricultural sector as their water use, and others don't. And if you don't, and you have a very large agricultural sector, your water footprint may appear much less than it actually is. So these, as we said earlier, we should be critical, we should challenge, we should ask questions to better understand what these metrics mean.
Yeah, it's like creative accounting. It's like, all right, we're not gonna count that.
It can be, and that's why we need to ask those hard questions. Are these metrics standardized across all countries? Should all sectors be included? Should we take a supply chains approach or at source approach for water or carbon emissions or methane emissions or whatever? And what implications would they have if we change these different methodologies? It quickly becomes like a very academic conversation, but in the end, when you receive the Instagram post of largest carbon emissions footprint or largest water footprint, it does mean something. So we should be critical and ask questions about that.
Does it mean anything beyond an Instagram post? Are there sort of like global governing bodies that, for whom those indices actually, there are stakes, there's real ramifications that affect the lived experience of people who live in those countries? Or is it just like a like a billboard music chart, like, all right, we're just keeping track,
I'll try to give a couple of different answers. So in some sense, yeah, there could be the billboard track, but there also is perception. And perception of countries matters. It matters for trade, it matters for political partnerships, diplomatic relations, it matters for trade relationships. So perceptions do matter, and these shape perceptions. And then next, countries, the dollar and cents implications of this is that countries can put in place laws, regulations, import tariffs regarding various aspects of these reporting mechanisms. So that could be about carbon, that could be about ESG, that could be about a whole range of things, political things as well. But there can be financial and economic implications to these various indices. And maybe the last thing that I'll mention is that most of us, see the big climate commitments and net zero this and net zero that, and all the countries are talking about SDGs and sustainable transition. As a part of the Paris Agreement, every country needs to put forth some type of commitment. This is the only legally binding component where they need to put forth a plan, but there are no legally binding consequences if they do not implement the plan. And so there are no dollars and cents consequences at that level. So I think across these 4 quick examples that I've given, it does matter. It just matters in different ways.
Who do you think is doing this best? Like, let's remove Qatar from just because that's where you live, and so you have an embedded sort of home team bias. But who do you think is doing this best globally? Like, who do you look at as a scholar and say, these people have really figured it out? Like, we need to be learning from them.
If you go to some of the indices and you look at who is like absorbing more carbon than emitting more carbon, you will find countries like Bhutan, others that do well on SDG reporting. You'll find like Senegal, and you find like some countries doing quite well. So I think we can learn something.
Sorry, Logan, is that because of public policy, or just because the nature of where their countries are and the nature of their population and and how easily things grow and how much water they have and what they export? Is it like, has anyone actually shifted the needle because smart people got into a room and, like made tough choices, and then all of a sudden things are getting better?
Yeah, I think we have really good examples of that from around the world. Whether they're lower income economies or higher income economies. But to your point, yeah, the answer is yes. that some of these countries do really well because they have a lot of resource endowments, like lots of rainforests that absorb a lot of carbon, or they have very low populations based and large land size, and so emissions per capita, et cetera. So some of that does factor in for sure. But from the second part of your question about how countries are actually responding to reducing emissions or responding to adapting to a changing future, there are amazing examples. And we can look some of the leaders in the diversification of the energy mix that we talked about earlier. We see lots of countries. I mentioned the Nordic countries earlier. They've British Columbia in Canada. Some countries have drawn on hydroelectric energy sources for a long period of time, and they've used that to essentially become 100% renewable, and that's amazing. It shows us that it is possible, but they have those particular endowments of water resources to draw on and so forth. Some have the endowments of using geothermal resources. Very few countries have been able to draw on that heavily, but some have, and that's a great example. We have some countries who have invested heavily into solar development. From Africa, Morocco is usually a good example here of investing heavily into renewable transitions with solar. And I think, we can look across. I've been speaking about energy. We can see that, China, for example, has done an amazing job at transitioning its transportation sector from an oil and gas-based one to an electric vehicle-based one. It undoubtedly leads the world in this, both in the production of electric vehicles and the adoption of electric vehicles, especially at scale as such a large economy.
Can I ask a question about EVs? Just because you touched it. Is this a net positive for the environment? I mean, I feel like as a completely uneducated person on this subject, I've tried to educate myself as possible, but I'm not qualified. To me, I mean, you can go back to the 1950s and people are like raving about plastic and styrofoam, and people are saying that this is like the future. We no longer have to use cardboard and wood, and we can use plastic. It's our savior. To me, EVs smell like plastic. Like the marketing of it, the fanfare around it. I feel like I can see the stories in 30 years saying, how do we get ourselves off EVs?
So let me give two perspectives on this. The critical perspective is that EVs require so much more material. And let me just focus on one component, which is the battery. You need lithium, you need cobalt, you need graphite, you need a whole lot more copper, especially if the whole energy system has more EV vehicles in it. And where do you get all these materials is through mining. And mining is not particularly positive for the environment. And for some of these materials, just quickly, like most of the nickel that goes into these batteries comes from Indonesia. And there's lots of concerns about environmental conditions on the extraction of nickel or the mining of nickel. Most of the cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there are significant, serious, and well-documented concerns about human rights abuse and child labor in those supply chains. Lithium, copper has mostly come from South America. A lot of the copper resources are being depleted. There's lots of concerns about, do we have enough copper for an energy transition, whether it's nuclear or whether it's more renewables, et cetera. Not only from the environmental concern side, but also from the supply side. Do we have enough of resource of copper?
And there's like planned obsolescence with the batteries built into them.
Yeah. There are some, trying to recycle, reuse. I mean, there's lots of R&D in that space. But to your question, the production of electric vehicle, battery and all, produces a lot more carbon emissions than a traditional gasoline-powered vehicle in its manufacturing process, particularly once you consider all the inputs that are required to produce them. So the critic would say, like, what are we doing here? And there are some studies, and you can find arguments on both sides. How many years does it take for the electric vehicle to sort of reduce carbon emissions compared to the gasoline-powered vehicle, in its life cycle? So there is a bit of a debate there. But I would say your concerns are well-founded because there's a lot more carbon emissions required going in. And the second question that's maybe less asked, I've seen a lot of discussion about the mining component and the environmental concerns about a lot more mining or human rights concerns in the mining industry. But the other component is when we plug our electric vehicle in, where's that energy coming from?
Yeah.
So if that energy is coming from coal, it's not a whole lot better. And some countries are, continuing to use coal or increasing their use of coal. So that's like another consideration, that if we move to a transportation system that is based on electric vehicles or electric buses or electric-based trains or whatever, where is the source of that energy coming from? Have we just displaced carbon emissions from the car to some plant far away, or have we actually changed our energy system? So the critic here is really right. We need to be thinking critically about these questions. If I take a different perspective, there's another reason why China and other countries have said we want to move towards transitioning our transportation system from gasoline-powered vehicles to electric vehicles. And one of the reasons for this is air quality. If you have a lot of vehicles in major cities, and we're talking, cities of millions of people, your air quality can be really poor, which is terrible for human health and human development in general, et cetera. Lots of studies on this. So how do we improve our air quality? One of the main sources of particulate matter in the air is from our transportation sector. If you see pictures of some of the major Chinese cities 20 years ago and today, it's an unbelievable transformation in air quality. And one of the main drivers of that has been transitioning its transportation sector from gasoline-powered trucks, buses, cars, et cetera, motorcycles, to electrifying it. So there are different considerations here that might be more of a human health consideration if the source of the energy remains a non-renewable one, coal or oil, gas, et cetera. But it may have still a positive impact on human health and quality of life. So there are different ways we can parse this out. For us in the region, we do have air quality concerns. The particulate matter in our air, because we live in a desert environment, there's naturally a lot of particulate matter in the air, but there's also a lot of human source particulate matter in the air, and this includes a lot of it coming from our transportation sector. If we're living in an environment that's hot, and we've earlier mentioned cooling is really important, particularly in the summer months, if we have cars idling in front of schools, for example, waiting to pick up or drop children, and a lot of that particulate matter, unhealthy particulate matter, is going into the schools, through the doors and the windows, or just children walking in and out, that's not great for their health. If we were able to transition that to electric vehicles, then there are other types of positive considerations that we might make that transition to electrifying our transportation sector, while it's slower to transition the energy mix of the source of our energy. What do I mean by that? I can go out and buy an electric vehicle today, and that change happens today. Building a major solar power plant takes years. So these transitions don't occur on the same time scale.
Yeah. The game Telephone? You speak into one person's ear and then it goes around the room, and by the end, it's a completely different sentence. Do you ever feel like the scientific community and the legislature or the sort of public policy community has this game of telephone when it comes to sustainability stuff? I'll give you an example. You tell me if you think it's a game of telephone. Okay. There was this big story about the water bottle caps in the EU, how they passed this, did you hear about this? Every single plastic water bottle in the EU is now mandated that when you open it, I think every single water bottle in the EU, when you open it and you undo this thing, the cap no longer drops off the. It's fused to the head, right? And it became this big thing of is this really helping waste reduction? Or is this just a performative act? And it's really not moving the needle. And there was so much sort of ink spilled and so much ink spilled in the press about it. And what we really should stop focusing on the sort of the Al Gore just change your light bulb approach and really focus on the bigger things. Am I wrong to feel that way? And if I am, please correct me. And what else is going on that's similar to that?
There's a lot. I mean, here you'll see a lot of emphasis on switching your straw or attaching your bottle cap, or even our earlier conversation about switching your car. If we want to be serious about a transition to a more sustainable future, these are the wrong questions, because we're just maintaining or increasing our consumption habits, and then creating new problems, as you said. Well, the hard question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we actually reduce consumption? How do we move from, instead of buying an electric vehicle, to moving towards a system that is more public transit based? And here in the state of Qatar, we have our public transportation system is 100% electric, and the feeders to a metro system, which is also electric. So ideally, what you want is a public transportation system that is accessible for everyone and that takes everyone where they need to go, schools, hospitals, work, etc. And we don't need to buy as many vehicles. And so you're providing options to create pathways to reduce consumption, that we don't need to produce as many batteries, we don't need to sell as many cars, we don't need as many straws or bottle caps. We've actually changed the system rather than replacing item A to item B. And that's a much harder transition. Although we have made the investment in Qatar to have all of our buses electric and have a great metro system, a lot of people still prefer to have cars. So this comes to the changes that government can make by enabling behavior change, and also raising awareness for the public that these choices could be better for your health, better for society, and even better for your pocket.
Cool. Logan, thanks so much. This is a lot of fun. People can find your research online pretty easily. I appreciate you trying to explain all this stuff to me.
Sure. Well, let me give you a final, it kind of relates to this question about what should we be doing, the straws and the bottle caps and the cars example. And there is a risk that we all sort of wait for the government to fix it. And there are really good examples from our region where other actors in society are taking leadership roles. And I think this is a really important, exciting part of the story, that change isn't just top down in our region. The top down change is occurring. And by that, I mean, building the solar power plants or making these large scale infrastructure investments. But also it's the bottom up stuff that's exciting and shows that the attitudes, behaviors, and knowledge of people is also changing and driving it from the bottom up. So just a few quick examples of this. There were some students in grade 5 and grade 6 who were at Qatar Academy Doha School, and they started this group, Activists in Action. And they started to raise awareness in society about reducing the use of single-use plastic bags, about reducing waste that goes into the oceans to protect turtles, dugongs, and other sea life. And it was amazing to see them. They started this petition. They collected like 10,000 signatures, and they're very active. And it's great to see, young people taking this and taking a leadership role and showing the rest of us what we could and should be doing. So that they're a great example. The private sector is also fantastic, that you see the private sector knowing that the transition towards a sustainable future or a more sustainable future or a more circular economy presents opportunities for them, and they can participate in that. For example, here we have Seashore. They've invested heavily into plastic recycling material. And for some time, still to now, as far as I understand, it may not be particularly profitable, but they want to build that infrastructure so that we can have this recycling capacity in place within our country without having, you've probably seen the stories about exporting plastics to, Southeast Asia or other countries and so forth. So do we have the domestic capacity to have circularity in our economy? Another example from the private sector, in Qatar, we don't have any forests, but we do use a lot of paper products. So where does all this come from? We have to import it. And one company, Elite Paper, they said, okay, we'll develop a mechanism to collect all these paper products, recycle them, and create a new industry out of domestically produced paper products. And that sounds really simple, but if your waste is not segregated at source and you throw your paper products in the garbage and it's mixed with like food or whatever, you can't recycle it anymore. If it's segregated at source and you have paper products, cardboard and so on, in one container that's its own, you can recycle it, 7 times. So there is a great business opportunity here, and the private sector made that investment, and they've done that. What's interesting in some of the countries in our region is that the tools and levers of other countries that would encourage people to take particular actions don't exist here in the same way. For example, in many countries in Europe or in Canada, the US, there's an incentive for you to return cans because you get a financial incentive for that. We don't have that. So here we have to be creative and think about new ways in which we can encourage people to engage in these behaviors if there isn't the financial mechanism that's there. And, somewhat surprisingly, there can also be negative consequences of these financial mechanisms. But I'll save that story for another day, or you can ask me if you're interested about that. Just to say, the private sector has been, a really active partner in this. And maybe the last kind of, non-governmental component is that there are a number of think tanks. There's an organization here called EarthNA. It's a sustainability think tank. They do a lot of policy work and research work. From planting, large-scale mangrove reforestation along the coastal areas to pushing policy in drawing on indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways, traditional ways of living sustainably and bringing it back into our conversation. They recently launched this big global prize for that. So some of these non-governmental entities are really driving the agenda, and that's fantastic.
Very cool. Thanks, Logan. I really appreciate this. This is a lot of fun. It gives me a lot to think about. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.